Oleg Penkovsky, the spy who saved the world, the man who should have been loyal. The train from Kiev to Moscow cut through the black fields of autumn 1945, its iron wheels beating a rhythm between faith and fatigue. Among the officers in the second-class carriage sat a young colonel of artillery, straight-backed despite the rationed air, eyes fixed on the misted window. His name was Oleg Vladimirovich Penkovsky, 36 years old, decorated, ambitious, and already beginning to suspect that loyalty in Stalin's Russia was a transaction overdue for payment. He had served with courage. During the war, he had led batteries across the Dniester, seen whole regiments erased by German fire, been wounded once, promoted twice, and had written, dutifully, to the widows of his men. The Soviet state loved such officers in principle, sturdy, obedient, expendable. But Penkovsky wanted recognition, not ribbons. In a society that demanded faith, he dreamed instead of validation. His father had died for Lenin before Oleg was old enough to remember his face, a Red Army commissar killed by the White Guards in 1919. The party taught boys like Oleg to see such deaths as inheritance, proof that history itself was their guardian. He believed it for years. From cadet school to the Frunze Military Academy, he echoed the slogans, "The party is wisdom, the army its sword." He learned to salute the idea of perfection. Yet perfection had hierarchy. The sons of marshals glided upward. Provincial officers like Penkovsky remained stalled on the middle landing. Beyond his competence lay a wall of privilege painted in party red. He had talent, photographic memory, precision, a flair for languages. But talent without patronage in Moscow was only frustration with better grammar. At meetings, he watched mediocrities rise on flattery and began to note silently the distance between rhetoric and fact. I serve the motherland, but the motherland does not serve me. It was the beginning of treason, not the betrayal of a country, but the loss of illusion. By 1948, he entered the GRU, Soviet Military Intelligence, an institution proud, secretive, and self-devouring. The atmosphere resembled a boarding school ruled by paranoia. Everyone mistrusted everyone, yet everyone drank together after hours. Reports were written for applause, not accuracy. Penkovsky excelled nonetheless. His instructors admired his discipline, his composure under interrogation drills, his ability to read a room as quickly as a map.
In conversation, he was courteous, faintly aloof, the officer who quoted Pushkin at mess dinners, who polished his boots before conferences and corrected grammar in communiques. It marked him as refined and therefore suspect. Ambition in the Soviet Union was safest when unspoken, but Oleg Penkovsky wore it like cologne. He longed for a foreign posting, the true badge of trust. Instead, years passed in Moscow's bureaucracy, promotions withheld by men less able but more useful politically. Rebuffs accumulated, humiliation brewed beneath his clipped salutes. He began to see the system as a mirror that distorted those who gazed too long. When Stalin died in 1953, the country exhaled contradiction, relief and grief indistinguishable. Penkovsky celebrated quietly with vodka, remarking to a friend that perhaps now honesty will count as loyalty. It did not. Under Khrushchev, the general's sons reascended, and Oleg's file gathered dust. He scowled at his photograph in the glass frame, the neat uniform, the unreadable eyes, and saw not the hero he meant to be, but the bureaucrat he had become. His marriage provided no refuge. His wife Vera, outwardly devoted, belonged to the cautious species of the Soviet middle class, fearful of gossip, proud of conformity. She loved him, but not his disquiet. Their apartment in Frunzenskaya embankment smelled of cabbage, shoe polish, and resignation. Evenings were spent between radio static and silence. He began taking long walks around the river, convincing himself that the cold wind was clarity, not loneliness. In 1955, he found brief redemption under Marshal Sergei Vorontsov. who noticed his diligence and drew him into a training unit for young officers. For a time, prospects brightened. Foreign travel, conferences, glimpses of the wider world. Yet prestige without progress soon turned to bitterness. Each mission abroad required the approval of party bosses who mistrusted anyone too articulate. He wrote reports the size of pamphlets. They earned him polite nods. At embassy receptions, he studied the Western attachés, their easy laughter, their unguarded curiosity. They seemed unafraid to think aloud. "We are taught to whisper even our pride," he confided once to a friend from military school. "They speak as if each man owns his own truth." The remark was dangerously thoughtful. In the Soviet vocabulary of morality, admiration was the first step towards deviation.
Ambition turned inward, fermenting into resolve. Penkovsky began collecting observations the way others collected medals, troop emblems, missile serial numbers, procedures at headquarters. He told himself it was mere professional zeal, but already he was rehearsing the habits of espionage, the precision of note-taking, the patience of secrecy. He read Western journals, memorized news broadcasts, compared Soviet propaganda with foreign accounts. Each contradiction deepened his suspicion that the motherland required belief precisely because it could not afford conviction. The officer who once saluted every order now began to weigh its logic before obeying. Disillusionment, like rust, worked invisibly but irreversibly. Why should a man of such promise choose betrayal? Pride, certainly. Ideology, perhaps. Yet at its core, it was wounded merit, the rage of intelligence unrecognized. He did not hate Russia. He hated the men who ran it. The boundary between patriotism and revenge dissolved. Somewhere beyond that line waited destiny, contact, recruitment, the whisper that promised purpose. For the moment, he remained a loyal colonel, but the decision was forming, quiet as a heartbeat after gunfire. When opportunity came, through a handshake, a party, a chance English visitor, he would step across it without hesitation. And history, attentive as always to irony, would remember him not as the general he longed to be, but as the spy who should have been loyal.
A dangerous decision. London, April 1960. Rain pressed upon the pavements like secrecy itself. Delegates from the Soviet Committee for Scientific Research filed into a glass-walled hall off Regent Street, their expressions carved into identical politeness. Among them walked Colonel Oleg Penkovsky, correct in posture, smooth in phrase, inwardly beating with the pulse of revolt. To the Westerners hosting the conference, he looked every inch the model Soviet officer, erect, courteous, eyes alert behind the formality of protocol. None guessed that inside his attaché case lay something most intelligence officers spend careers praying for, a decision freely made and beyond recall. The idea had taken 2 years to ripen. Foreign travel, once his ambition, had become disillusion's classroom. In Ankara, Vienna, and London, he had glimpsed the architecture of freedom. Shop windows lit at night, newspapers unafraid of sarcasm, strangers speaking without rehearsal. It was not ideology that tempted him. He distrusted slogans regardless of flag, but the intoxicating spectacle of a world that did not whisper. Each return to Moscow felt like imprisonment by habit. The courage to betray one's country rarely announces itself. It grows through small refusals, a letter not sent, a salute not meant, an argument left unfinished. In Penkovsky's mind, loyalty eroded like chalk under rain, replaced by an audacious practicality. If one cannot alter the system, one might at least outthink it. He rehearsed nothing, yet planned everything. Before the London trip,
He memorized embassy addresses, studied patrol routines, even practiced walking with a newspaper concealing a note in its folds. The message, written in precise Russian, was brief and formal. I wish to offer information of the highest importance to your governments. I served the Soviet Union in a position of responsibility. I do this for the safety of peace. No signature, only intent. The first attempt came outside the American embassy in Grosvenor Square. The guardhouse loomed through drizzle, a flag lifting wearily in the wind. Penkovsky hesitated, glancing up at the windows, each one a mirror of danger and promise. He slipped the envelope through an open gate and walked away at an ordinary pace, counting his footsteps to still his nerves. Within hours, the message reached the CIA station. Instead of excitement, it produced alarm. Washington, haunted by memories of KGB provocations, ordered caution. A Soviet officer offering friendship was as reassuring as a wolf bearing flowers. Ignore him, came the instruction. Probable deception. The note was filed, not followed.
2 days later, Penkovsky tried again. This time, he approached the British. MI6 officers, less bound by headquarters timidity, recognized the potential. The outline of his position, phrased in elegantly broken English, carried authenticity that not even Moscow could fake. "I am Colonel of the General Staff," he wrote, "and cannot continue without truth." The letter reached a man named Greville Wynne, a British businessman who dined regularly with Soviets and occasionally with spy masters. His contacts at the embassy passed it to SIS. Within a week, the machinery of careful curiosity began to turn. Where the Americans had seen provocation, the British saw opportunity, and perhaps redemption from the humiliation of Philby and his cohort. When the reply arrived, couched as an innocuous invitation to a trade reception, Penkovsky understood that his life had split in two. One part continuing the spectacle of Soviet duty, the other now belonging to strangers who promised attention in place of ideology. The first meeting occurred in a London park at dusk. The air smelled of rain-soaked lilac. Buses droned beyond the trees. Penkovsky sat on a bench, reading a folded newspaper, while a man in a gray raincoat passed without looking, dropped a cigarette packet, and moved on. Inside, a tiny roll of film, instructions, and a code word, "Hero." He laughed softly at the irony. That night, back at the Soviet delegation's guest house, he locked himself in the bathroom, turned on the taps to mask sound, and photographed documents with a Minox camera provided by his new allies. Each exposure felt like a heartbeat. Each click committed him further from return.
Courage and treachery are twins, indistinguishable in infancy. For every man who believes he acts for peace, another calls him traitor. Penkovsky did not see himself as corrupt, but corrective. "The criminals who mislead my people endanger the world," he told his British contact. "One must serve humanity, not the apparatus." The line pleased his handlers. It made for propaganda even if he failed. What they could not know yet was how much he could give. Missile design blueprints, deployment plans, the organizational codes of the GRU, and above all, a glimpse into the Kremlin's intentions during the escalating confrontation with the West. To MI6, he became Agent Hero. To the CIA, eventually convinced, he was the most valuable walk-in of the Cold War. To the KGB, he remained, for the moment, invisible. Back in Moscow, Penkovsky's double existence began. By day, he delivered reports extolling Soviet progress, his tone a model of patriotic enthusiasm. By night, he memorized secrets for his next rendezvous. He met his Western handlers under the cover of cultural exchanges and trade fairs, seeming every inch the disciplined emissary of socialism abroad.
Each journey drew him closer to exposure. Surveillance had thickened since the U-2 incident, and Soviet diplomats abroad carried suspicion like an extra organ. Yet Penkovsky embraced the risk as proof of control. He reveled in precision, code freezes timed to taxis, invisible ink smeared between business cards, parcels hidden beneath bridges along the Moskva. What began in resentment had become a vocation. Treason granted him the recognition loyalty had denied. In the secret summaries of MI6 and CIA briefings, his contributions would later be described in careful understatement, provided extensive information of high strategic value. Behind that phrase lay thousands of pages of photographs, analyses, and sketches that redrew Western understanding of Soviet power. But in 1960, none of that mattered yet. What existed was only a solitary man, half illuminated by streetlight, daring the world to call his courage betrayal. The note he slipped through a stranger's gate in the rain would, before long, alter the arithmetic of nuclear diplomacy and the balance of fear itself. On that quiet London evening, the Cold War found its most improbable hero, and Moscow its most dangerous enemy within.
The Western Gamble. London again, late 1960. The rain had not changed, only the stakes had. In a discreet suite above a Kensington hotel, two men from MI6 discussed a file so extraordinary that even bureaucracy lost its composure. The cover sheet read, "Hero," the code name chosen for the improbable colonel who had written to say he wished to serve peace by betraying his past. Across the channel, the CIA skimmed the same dossier with skepticism refined to habit. Moscow walk-ins had been traps before, yet this one offered a detail that caught attention: internal GRU protocols unavailable anywhere else. Even caution had to pause and read. Thus began the joint enterprise between the world's most sophisticated intelligence services and a restless Soviet colonel who thought treason an active duty. MI6 took the lead, more by instinct than instruction. The British had a tradition of audacity thinly disguised as method. They trusted intuition, even after Philby had ruined theirs. Agent Hero, they decided, bore the air of credibility. He knew too much to be fabrication, and too little to be controller. Field operations were assigned to a quiet network of case officers drawn from the service's Moscow desk. Among them was Greville Wynne, a businessman of moderate energy yet exceptional usefulness. To Soviet officials, he was the ideal intermediary, harmless, voluble, his briefcase equally at home with turbine diagrams or excuses for late dinners. To MI6, he was a courier with diplomatic immunity and nerves just short of theatrical. Wynne's task was pure theater: ferry instructions to Penkovsky during trade missions, collect microfilm through coded gestures, and maintain the semblance of commerce. "You are to look like a man selling valves," his controller told him, "and in a sense you are, valves that regulate history."
The early meetings took place amid crowds, exhibitions, markets, parks. Moscow was the stage, paranoia the set design. Penkovsky favored Gorky Park for exchanges. "No one listens carefully to happy people," he joked, gesturing toward strolling couples and children with ice cream. Within that casual noise, he would hand wine innocuous parcels, catalogs disguised as trade samples, within them the secrets of the Soviet missile program. At other times they met inside apartments lent by Western diplomats, curtains drawn, air thick with cigarette smoke. Tables were cleared of domestic clutter to make room for the tiny Minox camera and the stack of copied documents. MI6 officers, practicing British understatement even in espionage, afterwards reported, "Subject displayed remarkable composure under risk." The phrase concealed admiration bordering on disbelief. Within months, as rolls of film accumulated, the CIA revised its caution. Langley analysts examining the deliveries found data beyond imagination. Performance specifications of the SS-4 and SS-5 missiles, launch site layouts, command and control diagrams. The information aligned perfectly with U-2 reconnaissance photos. "He's real," one supervisor muttered, stunned. Real and indispensable. Washington dispatched its liaison, Joe Bullock, a pragmatic officer seasoned by Korean battlefields, to join the British operation. If MI6 excelled in subtlety, the CIA contributed resources and an insistence on procedure. The alliance was uneasy but effective. Their code name for him, Hero, acquired an irony that everyone recognized and no one said aloud. In rooms warmed by too many lamps and guarded by too many lies, they planned meetings as if choreographing miracles. Pencils sketched routes through Moscow boulevards. Code phrases rehearsed like theater cues. Margins of error were measured in seconds. "Never underestimate luck," an MI6 veteran told the Americans. "Ours is hereditary and largely irrational." Penkovsky fitted perfectly into their calculations. During debriefings abroad, he displayed a balance of zeal and precision that defied expectation. One observer wrote, "He speaks as if giving history a briefing." Hour after hour, he mapped the anatomy of the Soviet military, how orders traveled, where fear replaced doctrine, which generals favored pragmatism over myth. Beyond numbers, he offered insight. The Kremlin, he explained, feared Western strength more than it admitted. Khrushchev's bluster masked insecurity. The Soviet missile arsenal, far smaller than claimed, relied on bluff to deter confrontation. Each statement chipped a piece off the mythology of invincible communism. For Washington, it was revelation. For London, redemption. Since Philby, the British had yearned for a triumph pure enough to cleanse embarrassment. "At last we have the inside man they have never managed," one senior officer observed, half to himself. For once, the Americans agreed.
Secrecy spread like contagion. Hero's deliveries were so sensitive that only a handful of officers in both services knew his name. In Langley, President Kennedy read his summaries under direct courier. In London, the information crossed the Prime Minister's desk in plain brown folders marked Special Source. Handlers began to worry less about authenticity than protection. Moscow Center's counterintelligence units, notorious for hunting ghosts, were tightening surveillance on foreign delegations. Meetings became briefer, shiftier. Wynne found himself improvising, inventing business justifications on the spot, praying the Soviets remain decorously lazy between lunches. Through each operation ran the felt awareness of risk, so constant it became companion rather than menace. Wynne later admitted he no longer knew whether his own courage derived from conviction or momentum. "When both sides believe in destiny," he said, "chance has no owner." By 1961, the partnership was producing intelligence that altered strategy. When Western leaders analyzed Khrushchev's boasts during the escalating arms race, it was Hero's material that allowed them to separate propaganda from capacity. His photographs revealed missile ranges, silo positions, warhead yields, the difference between rhetoric and readiness. The Cold War's balance sheet tilted towards restraint rather than panic. In return, Penkovsky asked for almost nothing. Recognition, perhaps. An escape route, if required. He even dictated his memoirs for safekeeping, confident that history would one day absolve him. "If they kill me," he told Wynne, "remember that I tried to serve both sides, peace for them, truth for you." Wynne nodded, unsettled by the mixture of vanity and courage in the statement. Few men could claim purity while committing treason and make it sound like prayer. For MI6 and the CIA, it was the gold they had been mining all century. Their miracle agent was not a case file, but a revelation. Each roll of film justified the gamble that had begun in a London drizzle. The British trusted instinct, the Americans verification, and together they had found both correct. Every intelligence service dreams of an informant whose motives align, however briefly, with destiny. Penkovsky was that miracle. The tragedy, already forming at the edges of his success, was that miracles cannot be maintained.
The secrets of the Soviet arsenal. The room smelled of chemicals and cigarette smoke. A single desk lamp cast light across the film rolls, hundreds of them, coiled like captured serpents. In that dingy safe house off the Garden Ring, Oleg Penkovsky stood photographing history, page by page, manual after manual, until the small camera grew hot in his hand. The shutter whispered every few seconds, a heartbeat measuring both treachery and precision. Over 2 years, he would deliver more than 7,000 photographs of classified Soviet documents. They filled trunks, briefcases, and diplomatic pouches on night flights to London. Each spool of microfilm contained more truth than any defector, any intercepted cable, any satellite that had yet orbited the Earth. It was intelligence gold, mined by a man who no longer cared whether he was patriot or traitor, only that he was finally indispensable. Among the material were the crown jewels of Soviet strategy, blueprints and operating manuals for the R-12 and R-14 medium-range ballistic missiles, the weapons that would soon be directed toward Western Europe. Penkovsky's photographs revealed their range, fuel composition, launch procedures, and, crucially, their flaws: cumbersome erection times, limited mobility, unreliable guidance systems. To analysts in London and Washington, those details were revelation. Khrushchev's thunderous boasts about rockets raining down on imperialists were, suddenly, measurable lies. "We finally understand the Soviet mind," one analyst exhaled after a midnight briefing at Langley. "It bluffs from weakness because it cannot afford the truth." For the first time, the West could separate what Moscow said from what Moscow could do.
The flow of intelligence became relentless. Penkovsky's handlers barely kept pace, dividing shipments between couriers and diplomatic bags. Even the CIA's translation teams struggled. One officer joked, "We will run out of paper before they run out of secrets." Yet beneath the humor throned awe. Analysts poring over his material could now map the entire command structure of the Soviet strategic rocket forces, from field units in Plesetsk to the staff rooms of the General Staff. He provided the timetable for missile deployments, production numbers from Bisk and Krasnoyarsk factories, and the schedule of rocket parades planned for Red Square, meticulously choreographed illusions of abundance. Each revelation stripped the Kremlin of mystery, and in that exposure lay the West's greatest advantage. At the White House, President Kennedy read summaries stamped "Hero Source Only." They altered the ratio of confidence to caution in nuclear planning. In the absence of certainty, nations imagine catastrophe. With Penkovsky's data, the imagination yielded to arithmetic. Perhaps most significant was his insight into doctrine, the mental architecture of Soviet power. The Kremlin, he explained, operated on a dialectic of fear: project strength to conceal fragility, bluff until propaganda becomes reality, threaten to negotiate. Khrushchev's speeches were theater, not policy. Behind the curtain, the generals feared a war they could not possibly win. In sterile briefing rooms from Langley to Whitehall, men studied his words as theology. For years, Western analysts had puzzled over whether the Soviets believed in preemptive nuclear war. Penkovsky's documents and commentaries dispelled the nightmare. Soviet readiness, he said, was rhetoric. The missiles were too few, the command too hierarchical, the paranoia too crippling. When the Cuban crisis erupted 2 years later, those insights would form the invisible architecture of American decision-making. Kennedy's calm restraint owed much to understanding that the Soviet arsenal was paper colossus rather than iron titan.
In London, The intelligence summaries landed on the Prime Minister's desk under the codename Ironbark. The language was neutral, but the impact seismic. "This changes everything," remarked one defense advisor, "and yet we must act as if it changes nothing." Secrecy demanded that even triumph be disguised as routine. Penkovsky's photographs also captured the human texture of Soviet command. Who deferred to whom, which signatures implied belief, which were perfunctory. These subtleties became maps of trust and fear inside the Kremlin hierarchy. One MI6 officer called it a mirror held up to paranoia. Another, more poetically, described it as listening through the keyhole of history. For Penkovsky himself, the work became obsession. Nights spent hunched over documents blurred into days of suffocating normality at the GRU. His precision bordered on compulsion. Margins of reports bore neat Cyrillic notes in pencil. Verify later. Avoid duplication. Each phrase was both task and talisman, proof that order could exist within chaos. He understood that every frame of film was potentially his death warrant. Surveillance teams shadowed foreign missions ever more aggressively. Whispers among colleagues hinted that leaks were widening somewhere. "The walls have ears," one captain joked after a meeting. Penkovsky smiled, replying softly, "And some ears have cameras." Still, he continued, treason had become vocation, the only metric by which he felt alive. "If I fail," he told Wynne, "the world may burn. If I succeed, it might only smolder." When MI6 compiled his reports into official intelligence estimates, they did so with language deliberately bloodless. Hero material indicates substantial overstatement of Soviet missile readiness. Yet within those lines lay reassurance for generals, presidents, and millions unseen. The specter of surprise attack receded, deterrence regained clarity. In the private corridors of power, the gratitude was immense, yet unspoken. No medals, no public recognition, only classified relief. For the British, after the humiliation of Philby, it felt like vindication whispered in code. For the Americans, still learning the grammar of espionage, it confirmed that courage could occasionally wear another man's uniform. By late 1961, the microfilm shipments formed an archive so vast that decoding it became an industrial process. Penkovsky had become not just a source, but an institution, a man whose mind functioned as satellite and sensor long before technology caught up. Hero's material, a Joint Intelligence Committee note read, constitutes the most complete penetration of a hostile military establishment in modern history. Yet even as his information empowered nations, his position weakened. The KGB, increasingly suspicious of leaks within the GRU, began quiet audits and internal checks. Someone, somewhere, was feeding the enemy too well. Men were questioned, offices moved, telephone lines replaced. The invisible clock had started its count. But that knowledge lay ahead. For now, the West translated his microfilms into safety. The world turned one more time without catastrophe, and the nameless colonel photographed another page. Each click of the shutter was a small reprieve for humanity, and a louder tick for his own doom. The Cuban Missile Window opens. October 1962. In Washington, autumn light slanted across the Potomac, pale and brittle as the mood in the White House. A handful of men sat around the table in the cabinet room, studying reconnaissance photographs that seemed to vibrate with danger. The images were unmistakable, long cylindrical shadows stretching across Cuban fields, missile launchers still wrapped in tarpaulin.
President John F. Kennedy leaned forward, the weight of uncertainty sharpening his quiet tone. "How soon," he asked, "before these weapons are operational?" The answer lay thousands of miles away, in Moscow's filing cabinets,
and, more remarkably, already on his desk in Washington, supplied months earlier by a Soviet colonel who had decided that duty meant disobedience. Penkovsky's notes, smuggled out through MI6 and transformed into coded reports, had provided the essential key to those photographs. Without them, they were merely anxious shapes on film. With them, they became evidence decoded, precise, humanly understood. A year before the crisis, Penkovsky had sent detailed data on the R-12 and R-14 missiles now appearing in Cuba. Their range, fueling requirements, launch procedures, and crucially, their weaknesses. He explained that the crews were young and largely untested, that the missiles took hours to prepare for firing, and that any claim of immediate readiness was bravado for political effect. The Soviets, he warned, were playing for negotiation, not destruction. To Kennedy's generals, trained in doctrine rather than nuance, these details seemed almost unbelievable. "They're liars," one declared of the Soviet High Command. "Why assume they won't strike if they can?" But the president listened to the evidence, the tempo of fueling operations, the aerial photographs matching Penkovsky's annotated drawings, the cockpit checklists identical to his microfilm. "Then we have time," Kennedy said. "A window. Small, but enough." That calculation, born of one man's clandestine photographs, would decide whether the Cold War ended in conversation or ash. In Langley's windowless analysis rooms, technicians pinned enlargements of the U-2 images beside Penkovsky's schematics. Every bolt aligned, every cable matched description. He had cataloged even the ground markings for missile alignment in concrete pads. "He's been dead a year," murmured one analyst, unaware that Penkovsky was in fact still alive but under watch in Moscow, and still running the operation. The irony held. Never had a Moscow insider contributed so precisely to preventing war with his own country. Kennedy absorbed the material in long, thoughtful silences. He distrusted hysteria. He distrusted generals who talked of surgical strikes as if cities were mere appendices. The president's method, calm deliberation, supported by Penkovsky's granular intelligence, produced one of the most delicate strategic calculations in history: blockade, not bombardment. The Joint Chiefs, restless, wanted invasion. "We cannot sit with rockets on our doorstep," argued Air Force General Curtis LeMay. "We remove them now while we still can." But Kennedy countered with numbers derived from Penkovsky's files: the distance of threat, the weeks required for readiness, the limits of deployment. "Gentlemen," he said evenly, "there is no need to light the fuse when we can still cut the wire." Outside those closed rooms, the world held its breath. In London, Paris, and Bonn, leaders waited for news measured in hours. In Moscow, Khrushchev blustered on radio broadcasts that promised a reply to aggression such that imperialists will tremble. His cabinet, secretly aware of operational unpreparedness, prayed that bluster would suffice. They did not know that one of their own officers had already confessed their weakness to the enemy. Meanwhile, in the corridors of the Pentagon, the mood alternated between impatience and awe. Every time an estimate arrived stamped "hero information," the tone of the briefings changed: less fear, more calculation. Kennedy's National Security Advisor, McGeorge Bundy, summarized the mood: "The danger is grave, but the timeline merciful." That mercy existed solely because Penkovsky had spoken it into existence, a data-based reprieve. In the intelligence war, precision is compassion. Penkovsky's reports told the truth stripped of rhetoric. Launch sites required 48 hours for full readiness. Command protocols demanded Moscow's authorization. Soviet crews were still constructing proper bunkers under tropical rain. The missiles, though frightening, were not yet a gun at the head, more a pistol on the table, half assembled. Kennedy used that knowledge as shield against pressure. He authorized a naval quarantine, a blockade that would test Soviet resolve without forcing its hand. When Soviet ships turned back from that invisible line in the Atlantic, history bent away from apocalypse.
His generals grumbled that he had gambled on words. In reality, he had gambled on knowledge. Intelligence bought by a man now cornered in the very empire he had betrayed. Back in Moscow, by late 1962, Penkovsky was under suspicion. His contacts had frayed, his handlers recalled, his home searched by men who smiled without blinking. The KGB's net was closing, even as his work saved the planet from nuclear calamity. He could not know the exact hours when American destroyers sighted Soviet freighters, or when telegrams passed between Kennedy and Khrushchev. But he would have understood the pattern, that his information had achieved its purpose to prevent the war he was certain his motherland could never survive. He had written months earlier in one of his secret notes, "If there is conflict, there will be no victory, only the ruins of both." It was not an ideological statement, it was prophecy, phrased as logistics. When the Cuban crisis finally broke, it did so not with explosion, but with telegrams. Khrushchev, humiliated yet relieved, agreed to withdraw the missiles. Kennedy, triumphant yet careful, promised no invasion of the island and the quiet removal of obsolete U.S. rockets from Turkey. Between them lay a correspondence shaped by calm knowledge, by the comprehension of limits that Penkovsky's camera had made visual. In rooms on both sides of the Atlantic, the phrase "hero material confirmed" echoed through the files. For the first time in atomic history, governments acted not on fear, but on verified fact. At Langley, a senior officer remarked over coffee, "The true weapon of this crisis was information." No one needed to add whose hands had loaded it. That October ended with the world intact. Newspapers celebrated diplomacy, not espionage. The public learned of Kennedy's steadiness, not of the spy whose work had made steadiness possible. Penkovsky's name remained buried beneath layers of secrecy. In Moscow, his trial waited in silence, unseen, unwitnessed by the public he claimed to defend. But in the narrow corridors of intelligence agencies, men spoke his codename with subdued awe. It had been a singular bargain, one man's courage traded for humanity's reprieve. For 13 days the world balanced between light and annihilation, and it was the quiet arithmetic of a Soviet colonel, not the roar of armies, that kept it alive. The spy who stabilized the world. The world came within 2 turns of destruction, and one of those turns was taken by a man the Kremlin had already begun to suspect. In October 1962, as Soviet ships steamed toward the American blockade line around Cuba, history narrowed to a pulse. Every decision in Washington and Moscow drew silently upon the same invisible source, the thousands of pages, films, and notes that Oleg Penkovsky had risked his life to provide. To those who knew the material, the difference between panic and prudence was measured in hours of missile readiness. Penkovsky had charted that arithmetic months before, how long each stage of preparation required, how inexperienced the launch crews were, how false the Soviet posture of invincibility really was. To Kennedy, surrounded by hawks clamoring for preemptive strikes, those details were not trivia, they were salvation. In the XCOM meetings, while generals argued for air attacks, the president read quietly from typed summaries derived from heroes' reports. Every line was a counterweight to hysteria.
Their launch systems are cumbersome, one memorandum read. The crews have minimal field experience. Operational status cannot precede mid-November. Kennedy underlined the sentence and said, half to himself, "Then we still have time to think." Time, the rarest resource in a crisis, was the one Penkovsky had purchased with his deception. Had the president believed Khrushchev's boasts of instant readiness, airstrikes would almost certainly have begun. Soviet troops on the island, already equipped with tactical nuclear warheads, would have retaliated. The spiral of automatic escalation, from hunger blockades to annihilation, needed only minutes. Penkovsky's arithmetic bought diplomacy those minutes and stretched them into days. Khrushchev, equally blustering and fearful, received intelligence of the blockade and found that the Americans had judged perfectly. His bluff of invincible preparedness had been called, and he could not risk its exposure. "They know more than they should," he told his aides, baffled that the West grasped exactly how unready his missiles were. "Perhaps," he said darkly, "God tells them." No deity had intervened, only a colonel with a camera. As Soviet ships slowed in the Atlantic and turned away, the tension did not subside, but transmuted into exhaustion. The cables between Kennedy and Khrushchev became letters of mutual retreat disguised as triumph. Each side believed it had faced down apocalypse. In truth, both had been restrained by the same intelligence.
In Moscow, the drama passed in whispers. Ordinary citizens learnt only that the West had withdrawn from war. None knew that one of their own officers had stitted the balance through treason. Even within the GRU, suspicion remained diffuse, an atmosphere before it became an accusation. Penkovsky still walked the corridors of his office, tightening the knot of his tie, greeting colleagues with ironic calm, unaware that the reprieve he had given the world had shortened his own. When news of the settlement reached Moscow, he permitted himself a brief, dangerous elation. "It is done," he murmured to a confidant. "They saw reason." He could not say "we," for his allegiances no longer allowed pronouns of belonging. In the months that followed, Western analysts reconstructed the crisis with growing realization. The delay between Soviet rhetoric and Soviet capability, exactly as Penkovsky had described it, had been the hinge upon which Kennedy's restraint turned. Knowledge replaced guesswork, a CIA memorandum later phrased it, and civilization survived the interval. Langley's internal history would record, with chilly understatement, "Hero's intelligence materially influenced U.S. strategic posture during the Cuban confrontation." In London, the Joint Intelligence Committee echoed, "Without this source, decision-making might have favored preemption." Historians would express it less diplomatically. One man steadied the nuclear age by daring to know too much. Counterfactual history is a delicate fiction, yet the calculation here is simple. Had Penkovsky remained loyal, Kennedy's advisors would have faced a crisis blind. The U-2 photographs, unexplained, would have suggested missiles seconds from launch. Panic would have seemed prudence. With his data, panic looked amateur. He transformed intelligence from secrecy into strategy. Through his lens, the West saw the Soviet Union not as an omnipotent monster, but as a frightened bureaucracy, bluffing for survival. By shattering the myth of Soviet readiness, he allowed diplomacy to function within reality rather than imagination.
That understanding altered every subsequent negotiation. Arms treaties, test ban talks, the doctrines of deterrence that stabilized the next 2 decades. The Cold War shifted from superstition to statistics. Kennedy emerged from the crisis with new composure, Khrushchev with bruised authority, and the world with a term it would never unlearn: mutually assured destruction. It was a grim enlightenment, yet an enlightenment nonetheless. Behind its birth stood a colonel soon to be erased from his country's records. Later, when American historians examined declassified papers, they traced the chain of logic that had kept the bombers grounded. At its origin lay microfilm from Moscow, marked in tight English script, from source hero. In other words, from Oleg Penkovsky. He never saw the influence of his work. By the time the world exhaled, the KGB was closing in. His messages ceased, his couriers recalled, his life reduced to waiting. Yet the consequence of what he'd done thrived beyond him. Because he had measured missile fuel pumps and launch sequences, presidents could measure response instead of rage. Because he had dared to interpret the Soviet mind, humanity acquired a few more decades of existence. Looking back, historians agree that Penkovsky altered the Cold War's trajectory more decisively than any diplomat or general. He steadied the nuclear age, not through ideology, but through information, through the belief that truth, even stolen, is safer than ignorance left intact. The irony endures. A spy who betrayed his nation preserved civilization. A man condemned as traitor became the guarantor of peace. In those 13 days of October, courage and treason were the same profession. Oleg Penkovsky practiced both, and the world, improbably, lived to argue which it was.
Soviet counterintelligence awakens. The chill of Moscow's winters seeped through the thick walls of the GRU headquarters, but inside, the air was hotter than ever. The KGB, long the shadow behind Soviet power, had sharpened its gaze. The defections of Burgess and McLean in the West had sent tremors through the intelligence community, and suspicion now circled like a hawk over the GRU's corridors. Oleg Penkovsky, once a model officer, found himself under increasing scrutiny. The very success of his espionage had become a liability. His meetings with Western contacts, once carefully spaced and cautious, grew more frequent, a dangerous rhythm that betrayed a restless urgency. The strain of living a double life began to show in his eyes, in the tightness of his smile, in the tremor of his hands when he thought no one was watching. The KGB's surveillance was relentless. Agents shadowed his every move, noting the minutiae of his days, the cafes he frequented, the books he borrowed, the coded gestures exchanged in shadowed alleys. A botched dead drop in a Moscow park, a briefcase left too long under a bench discovered by a passing patrol, set off alarms. The message it contained was innocuous, but the breach was enough to ignite suspicion. An intercepted radio transmission, garbled but unmistakable, hinted at a mole within the GRU. The KGB's internal files began to fill with reports on Penkovsky's activities. His name, once absent from their lists, now appeared with increasing frequency, accompanied by notes of caution and urgency. Penkovsky's recklessness was born of desperation. The weight of his secret pressed upon him like the Russian winter, cold, unyielding, and isolating. He sought validation from his Western handlers, pushing for more meetings, more exchanges, more proof that his sacrifice was not in vain. Yet each encounter risked exposure. Each photograph taken was a step closer to the abyss. His personal life frayed. Letters to his wife grew sparse, his moods darkened, and the loneliness of betrayal deepened. Friends noticed his withdrawal, the haunted look that replaced his usual composure. The man who had once believed in serving humanity now served only the ticking clock of his own undoing.
Behind the scenes, the KGB tightened its noose. Surveillance teams coordinated with surgical precision, cross-referencing reports, monitoring communications, and preparing for the moment when the spy would slip. The machinery of suspicion was cold and efficient, indifferent to courage or conviction. Penkovsky, unaware of the full extent of the hunt, continued his work with a mixture of defiance and fatalism.
Each secret passed was a victory. Each close call a reminder of the stakes. The game had changed, from cautious espionage to desperate survival. The clock was ticking. In the shadows of Moscow, the spy who had steadied the world's fate now faced the reckoning of his own. The fall of Oleg Penkovsky. October 1962 began with the world on edge, but for Oleg Penkovsky, the tension was far more immediate and personal. One cold morning, as the Moscow streets lay slick with frost, agents of the KGB moved silently through the corridors of the GRU. Their target was no longer a shadow, but a man whose every step had been traced, whose every secret was known. Penkovsky was arrested without fanfare. The officers who took him were professional, their faces unreadable masks of duty. There was no struggle. The spy who had danced so deftly between worlds now found himself caught in a net woven from his own betrayals. The interrogations began immediately, grueling sessions designed to break body and mind. In small, windowless rooms, Penkovsky faced a relentless barrage of questions, accusations, and psychological torment. The KGB employed every tool: isolation, sleep deprivation, threats against family, and the presence of staged witnesses who testified to his guilt. Despite the pressure, Penkovsky maintained a brittle composure. His mind, trained for espionage, sought to outlast the torment. Yet beneath the surface, fear gnawed, not only for himself, but for those he had drawn into his web.
Far from Moscow, in Budapest, Greville Wynne, the British businessman who had served as Penkovsky's courier, was also arrested. His capture was a blow to Western intelligence and a stark reminder of the risks borne by those who trafficked in secrets. Wynne's imprisonment was harsh, his health deteriorating under the strain. The two men, linked by fate and espionage, now shared the grim reality of Soviet justice. The trial that followed was a spectacle of Soviet theater. Held behind closed doors, it was a predetermined performance designed to affirm the state's narrative. Penkovsky was portrayed as a traitor, a criminal who had sold his country's secrets for personal gain. The proceedings were swift, the verdict inevitable. Whether Penkovsky's confession was voluntary or extracted under duress remains a subject of debate. Some argue that he chose to admit guilt to protect others or to control the narrative. Others believe the weight of torture and isolation forced his hand. Whatever the truth, his words sealed his fate. Sentenced to death, Penkovsky faced his end with the same quiet dignity that had marked his life. His execution in 1963 was swift and unpublicized, a final act in a drama that had shaped the course of the Cold War. In the West, his sacrifice was mourned in secret, his name whispered among intelligence circles as a symbol of courage and tragedy. In the East, he became a cautionary tale, a warning against betrayal and dissent. The fall of Oleg Penkovsky was not merely the capture of a spy. It was the collapse of a fragile hope that one man could bridge two worlds. His story, marked by fear, interrogation, and betrayal, remains a testament to the human cost of espionage and the perilous balance between loyalty and conscience. In the end, the spy who saved the world paid the ultimate price, a price measured not in medals, but in silence.
Execution, or cover story. The official Soviet narrative was brief and brutal. Oleg Penkovsky, convicted of treason, was executed by firing squad in 1963. The announcement, terse and unadorned, appeared in state newspapers as a footnote to the grander story of Soviet vigilance. No photographs, no public mourning, no memorials, only silence. Yet in the shadows of Cold War intrigue, silence often speaks louder than words. Whispers circulated among intelligence circles and defectors alike, weaving a tapestry of alternative fates. Some claimed Penkovsky had been burned alive in a secret prison, a grim warning to others who might betray the motherland. Others suggested he was held in solitary confinement for years, a ghost used to train new generations of spies in the art of betrayal and endurance. More fantastical still were rumors of prisoner swaps, that Penkovsky had been exchanged for Soviet agents caught in the West, spirited away under cover of darkness to live out his days in exile or obscurity. These stories, though unverified, reflected the desperation of those who sought to believe that the man who had saved the world might yet survive it. The truth, as historians now cautiously agree, is likely less dramatic, but no less chilling. The Soviet leadership, keen to send a clear message to the CIA and MI6, executed Penkovsky swiftly and quietly. His death was a warning etched in blood. Betrayal would be met with finality, and no one, however valuable, was beyond the reach of the state. In the aftermath, Penkovsky's name was systematically erased from Soviet records. Archives were purged, photographs destroyed, and references expunged. The ultimate act of historical deletion, a man who had once stood at the heart of Soviet intelligence, was reduced to a void. This erasure was not merely bureaucratic, but symbolic. It was a denial of existence, a refusal to acknowledge the fissures within the monolith of Soviet power. To admit Penkovsky's story was to admit vulnerability, and vulnerability was anathema to the regime's carefully constructed image of infallibility. For the West, the mystery surrounding Penkovsky's fate only deepened his legend. The absence of certainty became a canvas for myth, a reminder that espionage is as much about shadows as it is about facts. His story was told in whispers, in classified briefings, in the cautious praise of those who understood the cost of his courage. Yet the silence also carried a warning that history is written not only by those who survive, but by those who erase. Penkovsky's life and death became a testament to the power of the state to control narrative, to shape memory, and to deny truth.
In the end, the question of how Oleg Penkovsky died remains unanswered, a riddle locked behind iron doors and lost files. What endures is the knowledge that his sacrifice altered the course of history, even as the state sought to erase his existence. In the cold calculus of espionage, some lives are lived twice, once in action, once in absence. Legacy of the man who saved the world. In the quiet halls of Western intelligence, Oleg Penkovsky's name is spoken with reverence, though rarely in public. To many, he is the single most important spy of the 20th century. A man whose courage and sacrifice shaped the course of history in ways few could imagine. His photographs and reports did not merely inform policy, they rewrote the rules of nuclear diplomacy and bought humanity a precious measure of time. For a decade after the Cuban Missile Crisis, American nuclear strategy bore the imprint of Penkovsky's intelligence. His revelations about Soviet missile capabilities and limitations allowed policymakers to temper fear with fact, to replace panic with prudence. The doctrine of deterrence, the delicate balance of mutually assured destruction, rested in part on the knowledge he risked everything to provide. MI6 and the CIA memorialize him quietly, in classified briefings and internal commemorations. His code name, Hero, is etched into the annals of espionage as a symbol of the rarest kind of bravery, the willingness to betray one's country to save the world. Yet this tribute is shadowed by the knowledge that his life ended in silence and erasure, a reminder of the cost borne by those who walk the razor's edge between loyalty and conscience. In Russia, Penkovsky remains a traitor, his name taboo in official histories and public discourse. The state's narrative casts him as a villain,
a cautionary figure whose betrayal threatened the very fabric of Soviet security. His story is omitted from textbooks, his memory confined to whispers among dissidents and historians.
This duality, hero in one world, traitor in another, encapsulates the moral complexity of espionage itself. Penkovsky's life defies simple categorization. He was neither saint nor villain, but a man shaped by circumstance, conviction, and the turbulent currents of his time. His courage was born of disillusionment, his sacrifice of a belief that truth could avert catastrophe. One man, armed only with a camera and courage, altered the course of human history. His legacy is a testament to the power of information, the peril of ideology, and the enduring question of what it means to serve one's country. In the end, Penkovsky's story is a mirror held up to the Cold War, a conflict defined by fear, secrecy, and the fragile hope that knowledge might preserve peace. His life reminds us that history is shaped not only by armies and treaties, but by individuals who dared to act in the shadows. Oleg Penkovsky's courage saved the world, even as the world sought to forget him.